Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. You can get more of our work, including a weekly article by Richard every Monday at our website, fff.org. You know, Richard, I oftentimes get emails from leftists or liberals or progressives who praise us for our positions on foreign policy against empire, against foreign interventionism, but take us to task for our support of so-called capitalism. And of course, this is not surprising. They're liberals or leftists. They believe in the welfare state. They believe in socialism, socialist programs. But what's kind of one of the interesting aspects of this is maybe it's a problem with labels, but they refer to the status quo, to the kind of system that we live under, as a capitalist system. And you often see this on liberal websites of, you know, look what the capitalist system has brought us. And it always befuddles them when I write back and I say, well, wait a minute, we support a capitalist system, but we oppose the type of system we live under. And they can't figure that out because in their minds, we're living under a capitalist system. And you'll see it on the leftist articles that deal with like the warfare state, that criticize all these military bases around the world and the foreign interventionism, the support of the dictators. They say, oh, look what the capitalist system has brought us. And of course, my response is, well, we oppose that. That's part of our libertarian philosophy, to oppose empire and interventionism and support a limited government concept. So I thought it'd be interesting to do a show on what libertarians really mean when they talk about a capitalist system. What does it entail? What does it involve? What are the principles involved with capitalism? What are the consequences? And in the process, separate out the myths and the distortions and the misconceptions, especially among people on the left, in terms of presenting this pure case for an unhampered free market system. What do you think?
Well, I think that we need to focus on a few things. The word capitalism was never one designed or adopted by the advocates of individual liberty, market economies, and limited government. It was assigned to the notion of a private enterprise, private property-based system by its opponents. Karl Marx, for instance, it was meant to be an accusative term that the wealth of the society, the capital of the society, is owned by a few and is used by them as the means to exploit all others in society who are dependent upon them for the access to the physical means of production without which the human being will starve. So from the very beginning, the word has had a connotation and a meaning, almost a definition, that has had little to do with the proponents of individual liberty and market economies in the 19th and in the 20th century. But more importantly, what the capitalist system rightly understood, not in this Marxian conception, since we just take that as a word that means that, first of all, it's a system based upon the right of the individual to own himself. He is his own property. You own yourself. When the founding fathers talk about those unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to say that you have a right to your life means that you have a right to your own person. This is your property. This is your personal body, your mind, and your physical being. Liberty means that you have an ability to and a right to use your property of your person in various and sundry ways that you find necessary and desirable, as long as you respect the equivalent rights of others. And an extension of that is that for a man to live and survive, to sustain his life and improve it, he must have the capacity to use the physical resources of the world in a way that will enable him to attain those goals. Now, if one sees as a starting point John Locke's famous theory of rights, social contract, and government, he says, how does an individual appropriate the resources or the property of the world for his own purposes? And he imagines a person settles on a land that is virgin land, never settled, never claimed or occupied or used for production before. He clears the land, he lays the field, he tends over the crop, and then brings it in for harvest at the end of the season. And Locke says that by surely both logic and an intuitive sense that every human being has of rightness, having mixed his mental and physical labor, the mental labor of the design and plan for the farm, and his physical labor of actually doing the work to bring it physically into existence, certainly all of us would recognize both morally and properly legally, rightly, an ownership to his physical property. So that is the core element of the market society, the capitalist society. Now, another way of looking upon this, in response to the Marxists, is that what is this farm that the farmer makes? One could say it's his capital, it's his accumulated assets. But while this is going to seem a little circuitous, I think it will get to the heart of a number of things and enable us to understand why Marxist criticisms are wrong. Imagine, if I can change the example, Robinson Crusoe, who has been shipwrecked on an uninhabited tropical island. He's thrown ashore, and he virtually has very little besides his hands. Now, to live, he might try to catch fish with his bare hands in the shallow waters around the island. Or he could take the time, and taken away from trying to catch fish with his bare hands, to finding a sturdy branch on one of the trees, breaking it off, sharpening one end by rubbing against a rock, and now he has a crude version of a spear. And he now wades into the lagoon or the shore of the island, and he's able to capture fish much more easily and in greater quantity than if he tried to do capturing the slippery fish with his hands. Now, this is time consuming, and the production is very low. He does imagine that if he had a canoe and if he could have a net, he could paddle out further offshore where the water is deeper and the number of fish and the variety of fish is greater. And he could throw the net out and have a huge haul in a fraction of the time that it takes him to catch a few, spending most of the day with his spear up to his waist in the shoreline water. But how is he going to live? You know, it takes time to make a canoe. It takes a time to make the net out of the vines that are on the tropical trees. What he must then do is he must take the time to collect enough fruits and berries off the bushes on the island, or however time consuming, catch enough fish that it exceeds the minimal amount that he needs for his own subsistence. And he needs to set it aside so that he has food to eat over several days when he is being able to redirect his labor efforts to cutting down a tree, hollowing it out, making the canoe, pulling the vines down from the tropical trees, weaving them into the net, and taking some branches and carving them into the paddle. Now, when he has done this, he can now paddle out into the deeper water, throw the net out, and in a fraction of the time, he will have what otherwise would have been with his spear have taken days, he will have in an hour or a couple of hours an immense amount of quantity and variety of fish. Now, what he has done is that this is what capital is. It is the accumulated savings that enables an individual to do something that otherwise his sheer physical strength and ability would not allow him to. Now, the capital includes two parts. Obviously, it's the accumulated store of saved food that he can live off while he's building what? His tools, his equipment, his physical capital of the canoe, the paddle, the net. So capital is both the means of living, the set-aside accumulation of subsistence, and the tools that will assist him to being more productive in the future. Now, when one presents it in this simplified way, one understands very clearly that it is advantageous for a person to save, work, invest, and increase his productive capacity looking further down the road. Now, how does this apply to the complex economy in which we live? Well, the fact is that all production takes time. Whether it's making the canoe so he can have a larger haul of fish, whether it's the farmer who clears that land and plants his crop and then has to wait the season to be able to harvest it months ahead, all production takes time. Now, each individual could try to do this for himself. They could try to work enough and then out of what they've produced, save enough to sustain them when they're making capital or undertaking a time-consuming production process. But most people don't have the ability to do this, and certainly not historically. They didn't in earlier ages. But there were people who had saved. And out of their savings, they would have the means and time and ability to make those tools and equipment. Now, to make tools and equipment itself takes time. So what you would then have is, let's think of it this way. The employer wants to hire some workers to help him. For example, to plant the crop and tend it until it's ready for harvest. Now, how is he going to feed himself and the workers who he's employing to help him on the farm, for instance? You could say, you know what? You're going to help me make this harvest. And when the harvest comes in, I will give you a portion of the harvest. And that will be your remuneration, your pay, for which I thank you for your help, for the work that you've assisted me to do in the farm's division of labor. But what if the people who he's hired do not have their own accumulated savings to live off until the crop comes in? The alternative is for the farmer saved enough not only to sustain himself, but to be able to advance the wages to the workers over the period of production, so they don't have to defer and wait until the production process is finished and the crop is ready to be eaten, to be able to have the food that they need on a daily basis. So in fact, what the capitalist does is that he saves enough to both make the machine's tools or planting the crop, to feed himself, and to be able to pay the wages of the workers in advance of the finished product. That is what savings and capital permits. Now, the perversity of this, Jacob, if I can just continue with this, is that imagine the alternative vision of this in the Marxian story. Okay? The worker knocks on the door of the factory. A little trap door opens in the door, and the businessman looks out and says, "Yes?" And the little worker standing there says, Sir, I'm starving. Please, sir, let me in your factory. And let me use the tools and machines that you have. Otherwise, how will my little children have food to eat?" The greedy businessman says, "Well, I am not a house person. Come in, use my machines, produce things." But of course, it is my machine. And it's only fair that I pay for letting you to use my machinery. So let us suppose that during a day's work, you produce 10 units of output. You can keep 7 of the units, and I get the 3 units for allowing you, I'm so generous, letting you use my machines. "Oh, yes, sir, I know I've made all the 10 units by myself, and you haven't done anything but sit up in your office with your feet on the desk smoking your cigar. But sir, thank you for letting me live and feed my little children." Such a nice thing. Now, that's the Marxian conception of capitalism. Okay, that is the Marxian conception of capitalism. This guy has arbitrarily appropriated these machines, the factory building the tools, and the workers have nothing to work with, and unless they concede to giving part of what their labor produces, with the assistance of those machines, they will starve with their families. And the portion of the workers' output that the capitalist appropriates for himself is what Marx calls profit. Now, if one listens to the story that I've told, before that, with Robinson Crusoe, or the farmer hiring the workers, what you realize is that it's not profit that the businessman earns, but interest. Interest is basically the return for having foregone consumption in the present to have a return or an outcome in the future. Because all things considered, if you could have something that you desire either now or later, would you rather have it now or later? Well, all things held given, why not have an enjoyment or a pleasure or satisfaction more closer to the present than some point further down the road? Therefore, for a person to be able to forego or be willing to forego pleasures in the present until the future, there has to be some premium, some reward for doing so. And economists have understood, particularly a variety of economists, especially the Austrians, though not only them, have understood that interest is basically the premium for foregoing the use of resources or labor or goods and services in the present until some reward or outcome in the future. It's called time preference or time valuation. Now, what the businessman is doing, he has saved out of his prior productions enough wealth to make the machines, manufacture them, excuse me, and install them in his establishment. He also has accumulated enough not only to carry his own personal requirements until the production process is finished, but to be paying these workers who do not have accumulated savings, either because of their inability in the past or their unwillingness to defer pleasures of the moment to set aside some savings to cover their needs over a period of time. He advances them their wages now and over the period of production. So they get paid over the production period. He will get his reward when the product is finished and it is offered on the market to potentially demanding consumers. Now, if it's a product that the consumers want, and he's anticipated the price that they would be willing to pay, that price includes all of his costs of production, hiring the workers, the resources and raw materials used up in the production process, the maintenance and repair and replacement of machines that wear out and need replacement, and his reward for having deferred part of the pleasures he could have had until later to undertake the production process, including paying workers their wages. That's the implicit interest that is included in the cost as part of his own personal income as someone who has lent himself, as you will, savings to undertake the production process. Now, when he sells the product, he may get a price that compensates for all of these costs of production, or it may not. The future is uncertain. The consumers may not want his product. So besides being the capitalist who lends himself savings to undertake production and pay the workers their wages, which is part of what he hopes will be compensated in the price he earns, he's also the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur undertakes production today concerning an uncertain consumer demand tomorrow. And when that product is sold, he may earn the price that he'd hoped the consumers would pay. It could be even more, so he earns profit. But he also could have overestimated the consumer demand, and he suffers a loss. Then he not only gets the positive return, but he will not even have enough to cover his expenses, which has included the savings that he's advanced to undertake the production process and pay those workers their wages, and therefore he suffers a loss. As a consequence, the businessman therefore performs unbelievable essential services in the division of labor. He's the capitalist, that is the person who saves, undertakes investment in physical capital, advances wages to workers to work with those machines, and is the entrepreneur who undertakes the risk of an uncertain profit of the future and may suffer a loss, including not even getting an implicit interest return on the wages that he has advanced to the workers, so they don't have to wait until it's done. Now, if one understands this analysis, which to be honest, I've just summarized Karl Menger and Bavark and Ludwig von Mises and some other Austrians on the general outline of this process. If one understands this, one understands the importance of being able to own private property. How can you accumulate wealth, either in the Robinson Crusoe sense of just food to have to eat while you're undertaking the building of the canoe, or accumulated wealth to be able to pay workers their wages, even if it's money, so they can then spend the money on what others are offering to sell in exchange for those sums of money for them to live off. How can this occur if an individual cannot own the means of production, his own savings, the accumulated machines, the resources that enables him to both use and to hire the workers and to bring a product to market? And indeed, the more the capitalist does this, the wealthier the society becomes. The more he invests in productive machinery, labor-saving output machinery, raising the productivity of workers, increasing the quantity of products available as well as their variety, and as the supplies increase, lowering their prices at which they can be sold to the consuming public. The businessman, the enterpriser, the entrepreneur who uses capital, his own or capital he himself has borrowed from others, is the engine of the market process, without which the productivity and the wealth and prosperity that we have would be impossible. He is a key player in the social system of division of labor. And without that player, we would have poverty rather than plenty. And it can only exist in a system of private ownership where he can accumulate to undertake the production process and the hiring that gives us the wealth and the standard of living that we take for granted.
Yeah, that's an excellent analysis, and especially your point at the end is very, very critically important. And that is, what is it that causes wealth in a society? I mean, Adam Smith asked this back in 1776. And the title of his book, The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. People from the left will always ask, what are the causes of poverty? And I know this from personal experience. I grew up as a liberal. I grew up in South Texas, in Laredo, Texas, one of the poorest cities in the United States. And I remember that question always being asked, what are the causes of poverty? How do we solve the problem of poverty? And they were really asking the wrong question. The real question is, what are the causes of wealth? And this is why my discovery of libertarianism had such a powerful impact on me, because the libertarians have really discovered what are the causes of wealth, as you have pointed out. For example, if you go to an impoverished society like North Korea, where everybody has nothing, essentially, and you ask an American liberal, what should be done about this? They would say, raise the minimum wage. Just enact a law making the minimum wage $50 an hour, and North Korea will be wealthy and prosperous. Or confiscate money from the wealthy and give it to the poor. Well, clearly both of these are fallacious. I mean, you think the North Koreans haven't heard about the minimum wage laws? If that could really increase people's standard of living, they would have done it. And you can't confiscate money from the wealthy if there's no wealthy in society. And so the real question is how do the wealthy come into existence? How does wealth come into existence? This is what liberals just don't conceive of. They think that wealth is a given, that the United States is just naturally a wealthy society. Well, it hasn't always been. And so the question is what caused the United States to become tremendously wealthy? And the answer is capital. Now let me expand on your example of the farmer. Let's say you've got a farm that's producing 1,000 bushels of wheat. There's only going to be a certain amount of money that's going to be able to be paid in terms of wages for those workers. Now the workers are out there using hoes and other handheld tools to plant the seeds, get rid of the weeds, harvest the crop, and the best they can do with the tools they have is 1,000 bushels. So whatever their wage is set at, I mean, the farmer's got his expenses, he's got his own food, his own personal bills, the cost of running the farm. So whatever all that adds up to, there's only going to be a certain amount allocated to wages. So the only way wages can rise is if productivity rises. Let's assume that the farmer all of a sudden is producing 10,000 bushels of wheat. Well, now all of a sudden there's a lot more money available to pay higher wages. And one of the best essays I ever saw on this was by F.A. Harper, who founded the Institute for Humane Studies, and it was entitled Why Wages Rise. And it's not because of minimum wage laws and raising the minimum wage. It's because as productivity increases, there's now more amount of money, real money, not inflationary money, real money to pay the workers. And how do we know that the farmer is going to do that? No, not because he's a good guy or he's benevolent. No, it's because all the other farms are now producing more bushels of wheat, and they start competing for the best workers. And that competition is what drives wage rates up. If people don't match the offer that's being made, workers tend to move to where they can make the most money. So here is the key to poverty, Richard, as you alluded to. The key is a way of life in which people are free to keep what they earn, and which they inevitably save part of, and that savings goes into a bank, which the farmer then goes and asks the banker for a loan to buy a tractor. He comes back to his farm with a tractor, and now the workers in that farm are able to produce not 1,000 bushels of wheat, but 10,000 bushels of wheat that then manifests itself in higher wages. So it's the savings that the workers are putting in the bank, the savings that the farmers putting in the bank, and multiplied by everybody else in the surrounding areas that is slowly or even exponentially, as we saw in the United States throughout the 19th century, raising people's standard of living.
Absolutely. If you ask the question, what was Europe and North America like 200 years ago? What if one could go in a time machine? What one would find is that the wealth and standard of living of the colonial America, or 200 years ago, was already in early United States, and Europe, that is in 1817, was not much different than what we see in that imagery still of many third world underdeveloped countries in Asia, Africa, or South America today. Poverty, low wages, poor opportunities. Now compare the Europe of 1817 in that imagery of what we think of third world poverty today, and to what Europe and North America are today. And what one sees is the contrast is that what has enabled prosperity to explode in comparison to the general poverty that prevails everywhere else. What is it that has distinguished Western Europe in particular and North America specifically over the 200 years? And it is the institutions of private property and individual freedom that have enabled people to have the legal protection to save and accumulate and then invest in productive machines to improve both the quantities of the goods produced, the quality and varieties of those goods, and to have the financial wherewithal to hire workers to work in enterprises to undertake this more and increasingly productive effort. That is in the essence of what separates us from the rest of the world. The fact that we have had the institutions, individual freedom, private property, and both of those in a setting of an open competitive market that creates the further incentive to direct one's use of one's private resources in ways that serves the demands of others in society as the means of earning the revenue to pursue your own consumer purposes. That has been the engine and the way and the method that has lifted the West, as it's usually thought of, out of the abject poverty that still prevails in too many corners of the world today. The right institutions recognize those behavioral characteristics in the human being that are the sort of the switches that makes prosperity occur. Men want and have the potential to be creative. Men want and have the potential to be productive and industrious. But to have them do so, being able to and want to, the right institutions have to be in the place. That is individual freedom, private property, free market exchange, and obviously a system of impartial rule of law, so everybody knows the legal and therefore the market contractual rules of the game. And once you have the rules of the game in those institutions, men can be set free to improve their lives, and they only improve their lives in society by trading with their neighbors and therefore bringing about mutual betterment for all.
Yeah, that institutional framework, the governmental framework, is critical, because look at the framework that existed throughout the 19th century that Americans brought into existence. No income tax. So people were free to keep everything they earned. They were able to save a large portion of their income because a large portion of their income was not being sent to Washington because there was no income tax. There was no welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Everybody relied on voluntary charity. So you have standards of living that are soaring, and the irony is now people have wealth that they can then use to donate to the needy, which was taking place in unbelievable amounts. And then you've got the warfare state aspect that seizes people's income to fund all the foreign interventions, the foreign wars. None of that existed in the United States, or very little of it. I mean, there was the Mexican War, there was the Civil War, but none of this foreign interventionism in Asia, Europe. There was no big standing military-industrial complex, no CIA, no NSA. So, in other words, you didn't have government siphoning off, sucking out all of this productive capital. I mean, you often hear this notion that, oh, government invests in infrastructure and so forth. That is not an investment. That's just taking money from people who would save it and send it into productive capital, seizing it and using it for some type of governmental project. The investment takes place only within the private sector. So if we then return back to where I originally started out, we don't defend the status quo. We don't defend what socialism has produced, the welfare state has produced, the interventionist economy has produced. We don't favor the warfare state. We favor, in an ideal sense, a free society, as you said, one based on private property, free markets, capital, savings, and of course, the ever-increasing standards of living that come with it.
Absolutely. The freedom is what a capitalist system is all about. Freedom of the individual to live his life as he chooses, to be as productive and as innovative as inclination and desire directs him, to be able to save a portion of his income if he chooses, as well as to consume the wealth from his efforts. And through that savings, to be able to invest in the machinery, tools, and equipment that enhance the productivity of himself and those, as you said, he hires. And out of that greater productivity and the higher wages that the productivity enables him and motivates him to pay, comes the greater output of more and better goods that in the competitive market get offered to all of us at prices that are competed down to the more efficient and lower costs of production.
Okay, on that note, we got to wrap it up. I want to say, Richard, that I particularly enjoyed your little one-act play or puppet show or whatever you called it. Quite entertaining. You may have missed your calling. And if y'all want to learn more about what we do at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we present the uncompromising case for the free society at fff.org, including a weekly article published by Richard, my daily blog. You can subscribe for free to our FFF Daily or to our monthly journal, which costs, and that's called Future of Freedom. Richard, enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Till next time.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next week.